Before I introduce our speakers, quickly introduce myself. My name is Stephen Shinnon, and I am with the WorkTango team, also the guy that sends you those emails inviting you to these sessions. So for our speakers today, we have two speakers. Our first is Rob Catalano. Rob is passionate about helping companies succeed by leveraging technology to make employees successful. Rob's been in HR tech for 15, 20 years now. He started as an employee at Achievers, a founding employee at Achievers, that is. And just a while back, he left to co-found WorkTango. WorkTango, we help give employees a voice and companies and leaders actionable insight. So thanks for joining us today, Rob. Our next guest, very excited to have Kelly Maine join us today. Kelly manages Trimble's global talent management team with responsibility for performance, employee engagement, the employee value proposition, onboarding, manager training, and more. Trimble has 11,000 employees in over 50 countries and is diversified, as over 47 products and services. The Trimble talent management team strives to strike a balance between consistency of best practices and the flexibility needed to fit the many different business units and regions. Kelly's academic focus includes industrial and organizational psychology, business and communications. She has a master's from NYU and a doctorate from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. So thank you for joining us today, Kelly. Before I pass it on to our speakers, just a kind of a note on the format for today. So we're going to actually be starting with Rob today. He's going to be kind of setting the table, talking about employee voice and the active listening model, for those that are not aware of it. And then we're going to pass it off to Kelly, and Kelly is going to talk about hers and Trimble's experience implementing employee voice and active listening. So Rob, I'll pass it on to you.
All right, thanks so much, Stephen. I'm actually going to jump onto the video here as well and say hi to everyone. I'm sitting in my home here, a little quieter than the office, with a tea, ready to spend the next 50 minutes or so with everyone, talking about kind of the evolution of employee voice and really trying to help people kind of get a sense of what's happening in the space, and how companies are adjusting their strategies. So I want this to be interactive. You're going to ask questions in the Q&A, as Stephen mentioned. But in the chat section there, I actually want to get a sense of if you can all give me one word to tell me how you're feeling today. Again, be as honest as possible. Type it in the chat. If you have it open, you're going to see everyone else's chat jump in there as well. I definitely want to get a sense of how people are feeling today. So, if you can go in there and chat, I'd love to see some, so we got energized coming up there, blessed, positive, curious, tired. Oh, Melanie, you're tired. We got some excited. Fraught, that's a good word. Engaged, some frustrated. All right, hopefully the frustration isn't with the webinar. If it is, let's make sure we take care. This is some good, I feel super spring and sprung in Chi-Town. Nice, I'm in Toronto and it's actually really nice here as well. But awesome, so that was a really good way to see how people were there and also get you using the chat function. So when I do ask some questions throughout this, you can definitely leverage it and use it. So thank you for that. So just by introduction, so my name is Rob Catalano. And if you don't know what that image is on the screen there, it's actually what we call a Bitmoji. So if you're into the whole tech and SMS scene, you'll know what a Bitmoji is. And if you don't, it's basically the modern Bitmoji. So if you think about the modern emojis, maybe we used to text each other emojis. This is kind of the modern one where you make look and feel like yourself. So as you can see, that's a very much younger and less gray-haired version of myself. And the reason why I bring this up is actually when I think about this topic in terms of evolution of employee voice, I started thinking about while I was messaging my nieces these Bitmojis. And I started to think that only 2 years ago, the only way I really communicated with them was through SMS and texts, and it was through FaceTime. And now I can't even communicate them, or they won't even respond unless I'm responding in these Bitmojis, which show emotion and different ways to express yourself. And what's interesting is even in a short period of time, we're having to change how we interact with other people in our lives. And it's very similar to what's happening in our workplace, right? Our workplace is changing around us, and we need to think about how do we communicate in different ways. And a lot we talk about today is how companies are communicating in terms of hearing the voice of those employees. So a little bit about me. It was mentioned that I started a company called WorkTango a number of years back. Again, really helping companies hear the voice of their employees, and a lot of what I'm talking about is based on things that we're doing with our customers and things we're seeing every day. And I also run an organization called Innovate Work, and it's really bringing the HR community together with an event, really kind of looking at the lens of HR and leadership through other leaders in the organization, in their organizations. We're actually running one in Toronto in April, one next week in Vancouver, and hopefully we'll be growing that as well. Now, from a passion standpoint, outside of WorkTango, I spent a lot of time helping organizations really wave the flag of why engagement is important in their companies. So there's a UK organization called Engage for Success that I spent a lot of time supporting, in that part of the world where I lived in for a while. And I'm also part of the Enterprise Engagement Alliance, and I chair the Canadian division of really helping companies bring this to the forefront, not just as an HR initiative, but again, an enterprise initiative, and how this whole world of engaging employees is really something that just doesn't sit in HR, but sits beyond it as well. So a little bit about me I wanted to share before diving in. And now that I'm going to dive in, I actually want to start with a quick story. Now, we all know this company, right? Ford Motor Company, been around for a long time. And in 1907, Henry Ford had an attrition rate of over 700%. Right? You thought yours was bad. But what happened was, in order for Henry Ford to try and keep people on the front lines building those Model T Ford cars, he basically gave them a reward after sitting on the lines for a year, 2 years, or 5 years. And what's interesting is over 120 years later, companies still use that strategy as their reward strategy, right? It's usually our years of service. We reward people for basically sitting in their seat for 5 years, and it's pretty consistent across the board. So that's one story, right? We're doing things in organizations that were done 120 years ago that started with a first years of service program. Now, the next part of the story is we look at someone like GE, right? GE really popularized in the 1960s the concept of the performance review, right? That's when the first, ranking started in terms of ranking performances for usually that annual performance review. And again, 60 years later, companies are doing the same thing. We seem to be changing our logos in organizations and our branding even more than we're changing our people and HR practices. And what I find funny is that, again, we continue to do this as our primary way to deliver performance reviews in organizations. And I always love this quote, 8% of companies believe that their performance management process is highly effective in driving business value. And what's funny about that is I actually never met the 8% of people. I only meet the 92% that are frustrated by this annual process that, again, isn't showing them a lot of value in their organizations. And then we get something more specific as part of the story on the employee voice side of things, right? And we think about the employee engagement survey. And again, the employee engagement survey started in the 1920s in World War II by the US government. And again, 100 years later, this is what companies are doing to listen to the voice of their employees. And what I call all this is insanity, right? We're doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And the reason why I told these stories really just to set the table to talk about this concept where problems are durable, but solutions change. Again, we're always going to be hard pressed to recruit, retain, inspire the workplace, but the way that we do it needs to change with it, right? The workforce is changing around us, and what we were doing 60, 100 years ago today isn't going to be working to drive engagement and performance in our organizations. So that all being said, what I really want to cover today and what we're going to talk about are these items. The first is what is the evolution of employee voice and how it's changing and why it's changing. Then what I want to get into is really something more tactical. What are 5 ways to really improve the employee voice mindset and approach in your organizations? Now, above and beyond that, then we'll get into introducing Kelly, who will talk about her story and how they're going on a journey in improving the voice of their employees. And then we'll end it off, and it'll come back to me, just some considerations of where you should start, right? If you were going to go down this road, really change your employee voice strategy, what mindset should you have? Where could you start in terms of starting that journey? And as we go through this, again, continue to ask questions, and Stephen will be collecting those, and we'll leave some time at the end to be able to answer all those at the end. Now, I love this picture because when you actually search "who cares" into Google, this is the first image that shows up. And I don't know, but Google is an amazing technology where I can't think of a better image that could depict who cares. But why should we care about this? Why should we even be talking about, the evolution of employee voice or how to improve that in our organizations? And I think quite blankly, the workplace has changed, so should this employee listening approach, right? Again, we're continuing to do things we've done for a long time. And the reality is this as well, right? 20 years later, all of this fits in your pocket, right? Again, things are changing and we need to be able to change our approach to hear our employees better than that, annual engagement survey. And what's interesting is after asking many companies and doing some research, we asked people, what's wrong with today's approach to hearing the voice of employees? And there were 4 major things that came back that I wanted to share with everyone. The first was it was too infrequent. So again, a lot of companies are saying that annual engagement survey doesn't, our companies move a lot quicker and faster than annually. There's not a lot of accountability in terms of changing behaviors when you're looking at information or insights one day and then only looking at it 364 days later. So a lot came back of that was an issue. It's too infrequent for how fast and rapid our organizations move. The second thing we kept hearing was what's wrong with it, which is quite cumbersome. Right? Employees can't provide their feedback on a mobile device. Employees are filling out 100 questions and spending 40 minutes providing you feedback. And then there was a lot of data and insight there that no one was enjoying the experience. Right? And people saw this engagement survey as an event and not just this standard process that happens in companies. Now, another part of the feedback in terms of what was wrong with today's approach to hearing the voice of employees was the concept of inaccuracy, where most companies were going down this process. They were either internally looking at the data and trying to amalgamate it all or waiting 3 or 4 months from a vendor to see what the responses were. And then they were pretty inaccurate by the time they could actually do something with it. And in many cases, it went to HR. HR spent another month getting that into the hands of all the leaders and other parts of the organization that arguably can have a bigger influence on engagement or performance or responding to this feedback from employees. And again, by the time that information was getting behaviored, again, so many things have changed in people's teams and organizations, right? So it became irrelevant, as well as inaccurate. And the last thing that really struck me was that, these processes and these investments are taking a lot of time, effort, but what has the ROI been? Are we seeing an influence on doing this in a very infrequent and seeing the data on a later basis? So what's interesting is that, when we started looking at hearing from companies on what the challenges were, these are the things we started to hear. Now, the reason why we should also care is not because, people think the process isn't working great that we're doing today, but there's a lot of research out there as well. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but even some research out showing that even managers have a number of benefits to firms that enable voice to, be more frequent and be more relevant in an organization. Things like increased employee loyalty and commitment, right? Increased organizational performance, decreased absenteeism. And even taking it a step further, the good study here that was shown in HR Monthly was comparing low voice organizations versus high voice organizations. And on the left there, you're seeing some major concepts: employee engagement, trust and leadership, change management, cross-unit cooperation. And in all those cases, when companies were enabling more frequent and high voice initiatives, that's where they were seeing improvements in all those layers. So that all being said, I wanted to set the table in terms of why we're talking about it, why it matters, why we should care, is because it actually makes an impact in an organization. And what I wanted to do is then segue into the 5 ways to improve the employee voice and mindset and approach in your organizations. And after I get done the 5 ways, I'll kind of send it over to Kelly to talk about what Trimble is doing in their organization. So the first thing in terms of the ways to improve your employee voice mindset is the concept of using consumer principles, right? So thinking about what we do in our organizations for our customers and using those same concepts for the employee. And again, if we think about expectations of customers, which again, employees are the same people, right? Customers and employees are the same human beings that walk in and out of our offices every day. These are the expectations of the workplace, right? They're not going to tolerate poor service, right? I call this the consumerization of HR. Next year, 75% of the workforce is going to be the millennial organization. And these are the experiences they have. And think about, even regardless of what generation you're in, I wake up in the morning and I tell Siri to open my heat, make a coffee, turn on the lights, do all these things. It's quite embarrassing, but we have this expectation of speed And from an organization, we're not getting that type of feedback. I always say that we go into the workplace and it feels like technology has moved back, 10 years, or what we can do in terms of ordering a coffee on an app, it takes us 2 weeks to find out how many sick days we have or how many vacation days we have in our organization. So the idea is the expectations are changing because of what's happening in the consumer space. So using these consumer ideas are really important. Now, one thing that I do that's on my desk every single day is this concept right here. And I'm not going to ask you what that word means because I actually completely made it up. But what it does, it represents something to me, especially as a leader in an organization, of what's important. And what I did is taking the concepts of CX, CRM, and VOC, which gets talked about everywhere in terms of the customer experience, customer relationship management, or the voice of the customer. It's taking, again, those concepts and thinking, I should always be thinking about the employee experience, right? I should be thinking about how our relationships are in the organization, whether it's with executives or every part of the team, or even the customers. And I should be hearing the voice of our employees just as much as I am listening to the voice of the customers. And one thing that really hits home to me in terms of this concept is, I really love this from Gartner. And what it talks about on the left there is, there's all these different customer relationship systems we have in our organization, right? Customer engagement, personalized contextual marketing to our customers, customer sourcing and listening signals. We look at sentiment analysis to understand what our customers might be thinking or feeling or what they're going to do next. We have loyalty programs to make sure our customers never leave us. And again, we do whatever we can and build teams around servicing and supporting our customers so their experience is so great. But why aren't we doing those exact same things for our talent? Right? All the things we're doing there, again, personalized, service and supporting our employees so they'll never leave, understanding their sentiment. So again, trying to predict what they're going to do or who the next hypos or the people that are going to leave the organization. So in a nutshell, it's really taking those same concepts and, kind of partnering with your marketing organization, your sales organization, and saying, how can we do those similar things from our talent? And one quote that I really love is that, and this is one way to actually have the conversation in your organization. This is from Troy Stevenson, and he ran customer loyalty at eBay. For every dollar spent on employee feedback, companies spend hundreds of dollars on customer feedback. In that Gallup study I just showed you, in the Gartner study I just showed you, they were saying that companies usually spend 11 times more on their customer systems versus their talent systems. So it'd be an interesting debate to have in your organization to understand, if you're struggling getting budget for these types of things or focus on these types of initiatives, again, comparing it to your customer world is a good example. Now, talking about examples, one thing that I find, when people ask, well, what is an example of this using consumer principles in the workplace? And it's something as simple as NPS. So if you're familiar with NPS, you get it probably a lot of times from places you shop or brands you interact with. And if you're not familiar with NPS started by Bain and Company a number of years back, was basically a concept of trying to understand someone's sentiment about a brand. And you've probably received, an email or a quick one-question survey from somewhere you've shopped in the past that asked you, how likely are you to recommend that brand to someone else or to a friend? Now, that concept has been used in the customer world for years. And what's happening is what we're starting to see is people using the same concept in the employee side as well. So, most companies call it an employee net promoter score. But the idea is using that same concept, asking employees, how likely are you to recommend this organization as a place to work, is something that companies are really starting to do. Now, that was the first way to improve the mindset and approach. The second is leveraging and accepting new technologies, right? We have to not go to war with them or this rock, paper, scissors. We need to kind of fist pump technology and bring this into our world. Because what's happening is all these technologies are available to us, and these aren't just random acronyms, right? Whether it's artificial intelligence or natural language processing or these different exponential technologies that are available, right? These are all available to us. And I wanted to ask everyone, and type it into the chat. First person that types what this is, I'm going to send you a book actually from one of our partners. What is this? Yes, Stranger Things. And if you didn't know, Spaghetti Monster. So these are all really good, but what is this place in Stranger Things? What do they call this place? Upside Down, yes. So if you haven't watched Stranger Things, you have to. It's amazing. But what this is this alternate world or alternate universe in this, in the Stranger Things episodes that they call the Upside Down. And the reason why I bring this up is what the stuff I'm going to show you now, this isn't an alternate universe, right? This stuff is happening in organizations today. And that's why we need to think about, and a lot of the major trends and where companies are going is, how do we leverage and accept new technologies to hear the voice of our employees in new ways? And for example, I have no affiliation with HireVue, but they're having computers do video interviews with individuals before they actually talk to a human being. And they're looking at things like emotion and facial expressions, the tone of their voice, the language they use. If it's a customer-focused role, are you smiling, right? Are you smiling, or are you, eye-to-eye contact? And this is what they're using from a technology standpoint to send people over to talk to a human being. And I'm just showing examples. I'm not saying you should do this stuff in your organization. Again, and I'm not promoting this either, right? Sticking microchips into your body. But again, these things are happening in companies. Now, when I talk about, employee voice, a lot of companies are leveraging technology in new ways to really amplify and understand the voice of employees and build a better experience. And just some of the examples we're seeing in the whole employee voice space, one is the concept of transparency. We work with companies every day that are hearing the voice of their employees and then sharing the insights with employees on a real-time basis, right? So they understand what their colleagues are saying. They're brought into the process, right? There's a trust and transparency being sent out through the organization. And again, technology can enable these types of things. Another place technology is working in the concept of employee voice is the concept of natural language understanding, right? So there's great technology to look at hundreds or thousands of your employee comments or items that they're sending that are open-ended, and be able to understand themes or sentiment around what your employees are saying. So it's tough to read 1,000 employee comments from a survey or from some other source, but how can technology identify what they're talking about most? Or is there a positive or negative sentiment to that as well? And some companies are going to the next layer, especially in this concept of employee voice, and actually inspiring their leaders by nudging them with what their teams are saying or recommended content to upskill those leaders. And I'm just using these examples because this is the stuff that's happening in organizations today, where they're leveraging technology not only to hear the voice of employees, but to get insights and make sense of it, but also inspire leaders to actually change their behaviors, right? By providing feedback or recommendations, or what we call nudges, to be able to impact behaviors. And you know what? There's a lot of other things out there, right? There are companies, and we've tested things where it's not just employee voice through surveys, it's even through what people are saying sitting at their desks or the departments. Now, I know that sounds a little creepy, and I don't know if people are buying that today, but the reality is there's companies that are taking this type of audio, doing speech to text, doing sentiment analysis around that and using the tone, and then trying to get a sense of what's the sentiment of employees in terms of understanding how they're feeling. And it's not just voice. If we think about other companies, the concept of wearing employee voice on your sleeve, right? There are organizations out there that have, similar to an iPad or a Fitbit, where it's monitoring your stress levels, physiological levels, to understand, is there something happening from an employee base we want to get ahead of? Now, I'm bringing all these up really just to make this point. And I read this the other day, and it really actually pissed me off. And I read that it's an automated world and HR is just living in it. The whole idea about this major trend or mindset is that we shouldn't be living in it, we should be driving it, right? If we think about HR versus every other department in an organization, you have the impact on every single employee. Our technology is going to be required in order to build a better employee life cycle, build better experience, and again, hear the voice of employees and make sense of that information. So that's the second one, right? First one is using consumer principles, and the second is leveraging technology to get there. Now, the third big trend that's happening, as well as one of the things people need to really wrap their heads around from a mindset standpoint, is making use of insights and not data. And I heard this one place where data is king, but insights are queen, right? And the reality is you can just get a dump of data from a transcript, from focus groups, or from an employee survey, but that's not very helpful. And I actually want to ask people, if we think about we've ever listened to the voice of employees, whether it's been through surveys or focus group data or et cetera, in the chat, just if you have ever experienced this, and just, I'd love everyone to participate. If this is how you look at your employee voice information, just type yes in the chat. Like, I'm interested to see if this is really impacting people on a day-to-day basis. So a couple are flying in. Yeah, and I love that I saw a couple of no's there, a couple of haha yeses. And what's interesting is when I usually do this and there's people in a room, 90% of people, this is their experience. And it's great to see some people that are, this isn't what they have to deal with. And I always say then they have to find the organization, Excel superhero or someone, or they have that skill set to make sense of all this data. We're just spending a lot of time and effort really trying to get the data in order to actually change your behaviors and act on it. That's why the data is not important. It's really about those insights. And one thing caught my eye, and I'm looking at another screen every time I look up, by the way, and it said, no, the stories are what important. And that's when companies are saying, okay, if I can leverage technology and get information in more real time, but also see those stories, things are trending up, they're trending down. I can isolate a part of the business where sentiment's really low. Now this allows you to use those insights to actually better change your behaviors. So again, this concept I think is not just for employee voice. I think it's pretty universal in terms of how HR and organizations are functioning. But again, you need to use the insights that come from employee voice as opposed to just this database of, of stuff that you're going to have to filter through. Now, what's interesting is, I love Josh Berson's, a quote here, and this was only, this was a year and a half ago, but it said 2017 have seen people analytics arrive with a vengeance. 69% of companies studied have been actively taking steps to improve the way they look at people compared to only 10 to 15% before. So it's just really kind of a motivator that if we're still in that, in that group that isn't looking at using people analytics and data to start making some of these better people decisions, you need to start looking at that in your world as well. Now, one other thing about data and insights that more of a recommendation or consideration, as you go down this road, whether it's employee voice or other HR data, is the concept of pushing and pulling. So it's great if you have all this insight and dashboards and all this information sitting in HR, but if you're going to have to make sure that you're, having leaders pull that information from you or other parts of the business pull that from you, it may not be top of mind from them. Right? It may not be something they have easy access to. You still have a manual component of someone asking for information and then HR having to deliver it to them. So the real concept is how do we push information, again, these insights to your leaders, to other parts of the business in real time. So we always think about data being this collection exercise, but when we think about if you're doing, again, employee surveys or other feedback mechanisms, it can't just sit in HR. How do you serve it to the people that are going to have a big impact on making change in the organization? And I actually love the comment there about the stories or what's important. One of the best pieces of advice I received when it was about the concepts of using data or insights was the concept of the art of data, right? And the art stands for absolute, relative, and trend. And again, if you're going into someone explaining, engagement is 60% as an absolute number, it's not very, impactful, right? It doesn't really mean anything unless it's relative to something, unless it's trended in the stories that it's going up or down. So, I always say if you're ever going to use some of this data and insights from your employee voice initiatives, make sure it comes with a lens of this art of the data when you're communicating it to others. It goes a long way of really, really making sure that story is being heard. And why this is all important, again, better people insights get better people decisions. I mean, I've used data and insights from engagement and recognition to literally predict attrition in organizations up to 80%, right? Literally just by looking at data, understanding who's going to leave the organization on how they interact with others, some of the concepts and what they're responding to, whether they're being recognized or not. Again, with this type of data, we could really try to get ahead of those or identify who the high posts in an organization are. So, it's a big world. It's a big concept, the people analytics space. But in the context of employee voice, we need to figure out where, if we're going out and doing these surveys, for example, and sitting on all this data, again, how are you looking in a way that's actually going to tell the story to allow you to change a behavior? Now, that's the third kind of major trend and mindset to go on when going through this employee voice process. The fourth is the concept of really being more agile. And I love this picture. But when we think about agility, it's hard to see on, without seeing everyone on the other side here. But from an agility standpoint, the concept of agility came from agile development. So if any of your organizations are, have technology builders, developers, where you're developing, again, whether it's different types of technology, the concept came from the different way of building, and developing technology in companies. And when I looked up what this actually meant as a definition, I had to share with everyone here. I think I've never seen so many big words in one sentence, but it does a really good job explaining it, right? How does agile development, and again, this is kind of a difference, and I'll share what the difference is on how companies used to develop products in the past, but it helps teams respond to unpredictability through incremental iterative work cadences and empirical feedback, right? Agile methodologies are an alternative to waterfall or traditional sequential development. So taking that concept of waterfall and agile, this is a more visual way to show this. And again, if the concept of agile is new to you from a development standpoint, the way companies used to build technology is that waterfall method. So the dice there are a chance of failure. The dollars are a project run rate from a cost standpoint. And what happened is companies used to develop, right, all these specs and identify this is the product we're going to build. And they would build it, they would build it, they would build it, and get to the right there where they'd have a deliverable product, cost a lot of money, but no one's ever touched it. No one's ever tested it or used it. And again, that chance of failure is really high. But from an agile development standpoint, what companies do is they actually build technology and ship it out. And again, it could fail right away, but you have invested a lot of time and dollars in wasting your time and building the wrong thing. So these two concepts are really what companies are starting to do in organizations when it comes to your employee voice practices, right? It's not, again, that annual engagement survey. It is more frequency in terms of hearing the voice of the employees in a company. And I think about taking this to a personal level, right? From a personal level, I always talk about, a story about, if anyone here has played sports or you have children that play sports, think about your child not getting any feedback until the end of the season for every sport they're playing. So, my nieces play soccer. I can't imagine that they go through the soccer, they go through the year, they play a bunch of games, and we give them feedback at the end of the year. But yet we do that for a lot of our employees as well, whether it's through the, an annual performance review or we ask their feedback, at the end of the year. And what's interesting is you think about professional sports, right? And I'm in Toronto here, I'm a big Leaf fan, but, Coach Babcock isn't giving feedback to their players at the end of the year or the end of each game or the end of each period, right? Or it's really every shift, every pass, every goal. So we think about this concept of agility is that if we can hear the voice of employees more frequently as we go through the journey of, the purpose of the organization or hitting our goals, now we can start building a better experience and changing the approach based on the feedback we're getting. Right? It's no different than building technology, right? We're going to get feedback early to then build a better product as opposed to doing one thing for a year and never getting feedback from our employees. And what's happening is because of this and this agility, companies are really changing their approach. And the evolution of employee voice has really changed from this annual survey to what a lot of companies are doing, which are pulses. And a lot of companies, they'll take the same 5 questions every week or 10 questions every quarter and ask employees that. And again, it's better because it's more frequent. But what we found in a lot of the research is it's pretty redundant. It's the same questions all the time. So companies have been moving this world to what we call active listening. And active listening is really digging into what's happening in the organization at that moment in time, being more frequent in listening to employees. In fact, we have organizations that not every quarter, some every month, some every 2 weeks, some every week are doing quick active listening surveys to employees to understand the sentiment. So again, they can be more agile in changing their behaviors or creating a better experience. And an example of this from an active listening is, and this is a model that we share with a lot of people we work with, is what companies are going to is they're not making this just an engagement initiative, right? They might have their big engagement survey baseline, but again, on a more frequent cadence, they're measuring an overall measurement of engagement, something like in the NPS. They're rotating engagement drivers to get trends in more real time. And again, when you're getting trends in real time about what you've asked in your engagement surveys, for example, that's when you can change your behaviors. That's when you could see what's happening in more real time to change a process. But it's not just the measurement what companies are doing. They're actually using diagnostics. They're digging deeper into the feedback of what they might have heard in a previous survey, right? They're digging in and understanding sentiment on change that might be happening in the organization. Or maybe you rolled out an open enrollment plan and you want feedback on what people think about that. A lot of companies put open-ended comments, see what's on may not be here. Companies are getting away from that annual survey, for example, and more frequently trying to get insights, again, not just on engagement drivers, but things that are happening relative to the company at that moment in time. And usually when I bring up that example, A lot of people ask, aren't people going to get survey fatigue? And is that too much feedback? But the reality is I don't believe in survey fatigue. There's lack of action fatigue, right? Organizations that are doing this more frequently and being more agile and listening to the voice of their employees, yes, there's a commitment to actually do something about it. But the results are some of the things I showed earlier, right? Increases in engagement, increases in collaboration, increase in trust and leadership, and giving leadership the information and data to make decisions. So that was the fourth one. And the last thing I wanted to mention, actually, the one thing is that, if we think about translating this to other data in organizations, we don't listen to our customers once a year. We don't look at our financial statements once a year. Again, those same concepts are starting to build its way into the employee space. Now, the last thing I want to mention, kind of the fifth before handing it over to Kelly, is that companies, when it comes to hearing the voice of employees, are really leveraging their secret weapons, which are the managers. Right? And you think about this concept of employee voice or employee engagement. Companies believe that they sit in isolation from the business strategy, right? There's a whole business strategy, then there might be a voice strategy or an HR strategy. But the reality is that the business strategy and the people strategy have to be in one, right? The concept that your leaders, again, this isn't an HR initiative. This is an initiative that all your people and all your leaders are involved in. And unfortunately, when we do things like an annual survey, when we do things like an annual performance review, we're really not giving the right tools to leaders to make this successful. I actually feel bad for leaders because they're the face of a lot of these processes. Right? They're told to do an annual performance review. They're given data about their employees from a survey 3 months after it happened, only once a year. Right? And then we expect them to change or adjust their behaviors. And you've all heard this adage, like people join companies and leave managers, but the reality is true, right? The manager accounts for at least 70% of the variance in employee engagement. This stat's scary. 50% of employees have left a job to get away from their manager at some point in their career. And the point I'm making here is that if you think about your company, right? You have at one end the strategic direction of what you want to do, and the other end you have all your employee behaviors. Managers and leaders sit at the bottom. So making them part of the process, making sure the information is flowing, right? This is important because if you remove them from the system or don't give them employee voice in real time, the whole system falls apart, right? And then you're not able to execute on these types of ways of hearing the voice of employees. So that being said, I did want to just kind of quick checklist here. And again, I know you'll get the recording and the slides, but just 5 ways to really improve the mindset and approach are these things: using the consumer principles, leveraging and accepting new technologies, again, making use of insights, not data dumps of information that's going to cause frustration or having you to manually go through it. Being more agile and more frequent in hearing the voice of employees. And then obviously leveraging your managers as part of that process to not only deliver them the information, but also build their accountability to actually act. So with that, I definitely want to ship it over to Kelly now to tell you a little more about their survey story, how they've approached it. And Kelly, I'll switch it over to you right now.
Thanks so much, Rob, and thanks to all the WorkTango team for inviting me to share a little bit about Trimble's story. Really proud of the progress that we've made over the last couple of years, and while we have a long way to go, like to think we're off to a good start. Working on advancing the slide here.
Just made you the host, Kelly. You should be able to click on it in advance. If not, happy to do it for you.
All right, not so far. If you can go to the next slide.
No problem.
Thank you. So a little bit about Trimble before we dive into our survey strategy. We are about 11,000 people around the world, and we just celebrated our 40th anniversary last year. 40th anniversary for core Trimble, but we say that we go back over 100 years when we think about all of the acquisitions. We're about 50% organic growth and 50% acquisition. And we have 120 companies that are part of the Trimble family. And so for us, that ends up meaning we're highly decentralized, and we like it that way. We like allowing our businesses and all of our employees to stay close to the customers regionally and from an industry perspective. But that also means that our challenges when it comes to employee engagement in a highly decentralized environment require us to be creative with how we go about having one employee voice and a listening strategy. So it's been a great ride to figure out how to unite all 11,000 of us in very different environments with very different cultures and customer bases. The 3 things that when I reflected on what have been really core to our survey strategy we're very integrated. We're integrated with meaningful conversations that our leaders and our employees have on a regular basis. We're highly integrated with our employee value proposition. We spent some time a couple of years ago understanding what do our employees see as the value proposition of working at Trimble, and we use our survey strategy to constantly ask ourselves, are we living up to who we say we are? The questions that we ask in our survey are reflective of our 4 employee value proposition pillars that align nicely to 4 quarters of the year. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But we use that as an opportunity to really, really reflect both at the highest level of Trimble and then within our specific businesses. And of course, with reflection is where do we need to do better? And in the future, we will continue to grow our survey strategy and change our questions as we prove ourselves in certain areas and see new opportunities for improvement. And I think that's really the Agile piece that Rob was mentioning earlier, is making sure we're always staying on top of the information and then figuring out where we need to go and how our survey can help us get there. Then the third piece, empowering our managers. So this has been really a core priority for us with both our performance strategy that has evolved to be Agile and our survey strategy as well. We don't want HR to be constantly giving data to managers and letting them know how we interpret it and what we think they should change or what actions we think they should take. Now, certainly HR will be part of those conversations and a key partner at the table, but it's a priority for us to give managers their own data, to make them empowered, to help them understand and react in real time to how their employees perceive their actions, the actions and dynamics of the team and the business, and overall Trimble as well, with regard to how managers help shape that perspective of our Trimble company. The questions that we ask are both key driver questions of engagement, and also they give our managers direct insights to the behaviors that they should be considering to be great managers, the behaviors that they should reinforce or change. So for example, one of our most recent surveys asked, I receive recognition for good work. So built into that question, when a manager looks at their data, if they see, over 80% of my people feel positively or favorably about this question, I'm doing a pretty good job at recognizing my team. If I see lower results, I see that I have an opportunity to do more recognition, and I can take that insight into a meaningful conversation with my employee. We have 4 quarterly meaningful performance conversations. And I can ask my employees, gosh, I didn't realize that I have an opportunity to do better at recognition. I want to do better. What does that look like to you? How do you like to be recognized? Or what do you think you've been working on that has gone maybe unnoticed? And while these conversations can be awkward at first, and we all have an opportunity to practice and grow into them over time, we're really encouraging our people to have the courage to lean into these kinds of discussions, start to practice them, and open themselves up with a growth mindset to use the survey results to drive action and change. Next slide. Thank you. Just a little bit about the logistics of our survey. We're only asked 10 or fewer questions, and we've branded it Take 2. It really does take less than 2 minutes. For me, I time myself. It generally takes 45 seconds or less. And at this point, we're not asking any open-ended questions. We had a long discussion about whether or not we wanted this. There's clear value in having open-ended discussions, and we want to grow into that. But we wanted to start slow and easier for our employees and our managers. This is only a 1.5-year old program for us so far, and we want managers to be hungry to get information, but also not be overwhelmed. And so we probably will grow into some open-ended information in the future, but at the moment we've just started simple and small. The frequency is quarterly. I mentioned earlier, we've got 4 quarterly themes that are the backbone of our performance process as well as our survey. Each quarter, we ask questions that reflect the upcoming quarterly theme. And I gave the example earlier of a manager getting feedback on whether or not they are giving a lot of recognition to their employees. And the upcoming quarter's theme for our meaningful discussions is all about the quality of our working relationships. So we try to make a really direct tie for managers to take their survey data, and then immediately go have meaningful conversations and act on that. And if we believe that this infrastructure that links all this activity together will hopefully make it easier for our managers to be able to show up as the great managers that they want to be, but sometimes don't have time for or feel overwhelmed by all the dynamics that are expected of them. The first bullet there in that quarterly section also references the ENPS. We do ask that every quarter, and we use that as one of our sort of key trending data points. We have found, which is exciting data for us, and I'll talk more about in a minute, that the ENPS is giving us some good insights about what managers do that make them great managers, and then what managers do that are struggling. So that's been a really valuable data point for us. We also ask a question about our performance process, continuing to get insights on, who in our population is stepping up and leading our performance process in a consistent and agile way, and where in the organization are we struggling to really embody the agile performance model. And that also has been a great trending data point for us. There are a handful of populations for us where, worldwide, 50 plus countries, we've got a handful of populations that require creative approaches to getting our employees the questions, getting the surveys to them. They're direct labor. They don't sit on computers on a regular basis. And we've got multiple approaches. WorkTango has been a phenomenal partner in helping us figure out what is needed in each of these different regions. And so we've got one population up in the Nordics where we use a kiosk approach. In China, our population takes the survey by paper. And then in some of our US pockets, we've got the survey being sent over to people's personal emails. So it's fantastic. If I can give a shout out to the great WorkTango team, who is so flexible and willing to work with us to make sure that all of our employees are really included in this listening strategy. And then we've got 10 different languages. And so each quarter, we translate all of our languages within our HR team and then get those uploaded into the system as well. Another big theme of our survey strategy has been using the analytics as evidence and really working on a quarterly basis. We're still finding our rhythm, to be honest. There's a lot of data that's starting to pour in on a quarterly basis, and there are so many questions that we want to chase down the answers for. I've just put a few of those questions here. One being work-life flexibility. We talk a lot about it. We tend to think that at Trimble we have pretty great work-life flexibility, where many of us in a global context are working around the clock with our colleagues in other time zones. And so we tend to allow for flexibility throughout the day. If people want to go to a soccer game for their kid and then join back at 9 o'clock at night after the family's asleep, just to use one life example. But how is that impacting retention and engagement and ultimately performance? We obviously have our business numbers of each of the 50 plus businesses that are represented at Trimble. And how can we keep digging deeper and understanding that element of work-life flexibility and how it's really moving the needle for our business? We're also on a journey of really defining what great managers do. We've pulled from Google. They had Project Oxygen a number of years ago, where they spent about 2.5 years really uncovering a list of 8 things that great managers at Trimble or at Google do. And we want to recreate that at Trimble. And so quarter after quarter, we're trying to build that short list so that we can reflect it back to our managers and say, well, while these 20 things are important, these 5 to 10 we have found are correlated with the strongest retention, engagement, and performance metrics. And then does the whole process that we have put up, the Agile performance process that Trimble has been participating in, is that process increasing engagement, retention, and ENPS? And we do have a little bit of data on that to share. The answer is a resounding yes. If you're familiar with the spectrum of negative 100 being the worst possible ENPS score, positive 100 being the best possible ENPS score, and red, yellow, and green here represent detractors, neutrals, and promoters. And what we have found, if we advance just one more, that People who have no quarterly discussion, who aren't participating at all in our meaningful quarterly conversations, have an ENPS average of 6. And that's neutral, and -10 really starts to drag you into the detractor category. So we're not close to detractors here, but we're not promoters either. And by contrast, people who are having focused quarterly discussions on the topics that we believe employees care most about, like their career, like the quality of their working relationships, like job satisfaction. When our managers are having these quarterly discussions, then the ENPS jumps up to 32. And that's a pretty significant spread. If there are any data geeks on the call who are familiar with the ENPS data, we're really proud that our quarterly performance process is showing us that it matters and that employees are more likely to recommend Trimble as a place to work. And we also have some data that I don't have a visual to show you today, but we also have data that suggests people are 4 times less likely to leave when they have the 4 quarterly discussion topics, and they're also more engaged, which we have that information relative to the engagement survey questions. So this is just the beginning. We've got a long way to go. And what we're really proud, WorkTango has been the right partner for us for a number of reasons. When we started 1.5 years or 2 years ago, looking at who was going to be the right vendor for us to work with on this survey stuff, my partner who runs HR analytics for Trimble, he and I met with 8 or 9 different vendors, the full spectrum out there with regard to the big folks who have been playing in the survey space for decades and have these really sort of robust tools that are fantastic, but might be overly burdensome in some ways, a tool that managers just get lost in and find very difficult to navigate. So that was a consideration for us. Then there were, the Qualtrics, the scenarios that are self-service. So we talked to 9 different vendors or so. And when we met WorkTango, it was sort of top of the hour. We had already been honing in on one of the vendors, and then we immediately made a switch. And then we did that for a variety of reasons. WorkTango's partnership has been real time versus a lot of the other tools that there's a delay. We really value that real time element of the tool because it fits with giving managers their data. It fits with our model of telling managers, this is your information, this is your tool, you get to access it, when it's good for you, when it's meaningful for you to sit down, digest the information, and that's been a fantastic element of our survey strategy so far. It's also mobile and smooth mobile. Each time I get the survey, actually, somewhere around 4 a.m. when I wake up, I grab my cell phone and I just take it while I'm sort of fuzzy-eyed. Granted, I am part of writing the questions, so I don't have to think too hard about what they are. And other people might not take it at 4 a.m., but it is that easy that with a sleepy brain, you can take it on your cell phone, and that's been fantastic. And I mentioned it's been immediately accessible for managers and employees, which has been valuable. It really helps HR step out of that middle position and step into that partnership role where we get to sit down together and talk about data as opposed to digesting and translating information for our managers and leaders. I also think it's worth calling out how flexible and friendly the team is over at WorkTango. And I told them that one of my key criteria as I was looking through those 9 different vendors was really finding a partner who we would enjoy working together. If you haven't run large-scale engagement survey projects before, it can get hairy. There's tens of thousands of data points that are being shuffled back and forth, and a lot of information that's flowing, a lot of potential opportunity for error, and just mistakes. And that's just sort of inevitable with the nature of this kind of work. And it was really important to me that I was going to have a partner who we could forgive each other quickly and bounce back. And the team has just been A+, the absolute best to work with when it comes to stuff like that, as well as continuous improvement. We have a number of ideas as a client of theirs as to how we would like the tool to look and aspirations for how we want to continue to show our information in the future. And the receptiveness on the WorkTango side cannot be beat. So thank you for all that you do to help us continue to improve our strategy. They also are helpful with our people analytics journey. We've got a pretty fantastic HR analytics team in-house, but we commit to our employees that the information we share or that they give us through the survey is confidential and anonymous, and that no one within Trimble can see that information. So that ends up meaning that WorkTango helps us with some of our analysis because we can't take the information from them to do the analysis. So we send information from our analytics team over to them, and then they're able to send back insights. And the information I shared with you earlier about our ENPS insights, engagement, they've been really key partners on helping us uncover some of those key data points.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kelly. We really do appreciate this. Before we're going to go to Q&A. So actually, Rob, just take a minute, go through the questions, choose a few, and then we'll come back to you. In the meantime, I just wanted to go through a couple slides. We recently came out with a new white paper. It's called A Guide to Help Leaders Act on Employee Survey Insights. 6 steps to get there. There's a link at the bottom, but I'm going to be sending you guys these slides anyway, so you'll have the link. It's a really great white paper. I highly recommend you go check it out. Next slide there. So actually, I mentioned this at the beginning, but just for those that are still trickling in, I am going to be sending an email in the next 2 business days with these slides and the recording. Next slide there. So here at WorkTango, we have a passion to improve work lives. And obviously, we try to achieve this passion with our services and our product and whatnot. But on top of that, we try to provide additional resources for people that share that passion, like all you guys. So we created a resource center with a bunch of free resources for you. It has webinars like this one, future webinars as well. It's got the white papers like the one I mentioned. It's got blog posts, videos, got some really great customer stories. We just posted 3 from Harris Computer Systems, Canadian Cancer Society, and RSA Insurance that I love. So I highly recommend you go check it out and take advantage of some of those resources. And last one for me today before I pass it back for Q&A. Just posted yesterday our next webinar. It's called Build Your Company Culture Playbook. Really excited for this one. We're featuring Josh Levine. He's an author of Great Mondays, How to Design a Company Culture Employees Love. And he's also the co-founder of Culture Lab X. Met Josh a couple months ago, great guy, really looking forward to it. So that's it for me. I'm gonna pass it back, Rob, with the questions you've chosen.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stephen. And thanks for the folks that are sticking around. I know we're getting on time here. And there's a couple of questions here. And if we don't get to them, we will, get to you and send it to you directly. But, Kelly, I think if you're still on, there are a couple of questions here around do the quarterly surveys conducted by Trimble allow for any conjoint analysis? Or, for example, what is more valued within work-life flexibility options or around total rewards programs? So any, I guess, other conjoint analysis on your quarterly surveys?
Rob, can you unmute Kelly there?
Sure.
Perfect. Sorry for the long series of technical issues today. All right. And while I was scrambling to look at that, can you repeat the question one more time?
Just do the quarterly surveys conducted by Trimble allow for any conjoint analysis? So for example, what is more valued within work-life flexibility options or around total rewards programs or other analysis?
I see. Not at this time. I think it's something for us to grow into. Back to the idea of just crawl, walk, run. We really started as simple as possible and have just focused on things that managers can influence and impact pretty easily, and minimal around the bigger kinds of questions. So we're just in a simple mode for now.
Okay. And another question came in I really liked was, Kelly or Rob, do you have any best practices for ensuring high adoption of managers to action on the results? Now, I mean, just from my perspective and seeing with a lot of companies that have, worked with us, the first step is kind of that part about, really leveraging your leaders and getting them that information in real time. So HR not having to be a filter in getting the information that's relevant to their teams. And I find there is a lot of adoption, and it goes higher when they're seeing their own information, they're seeing their own trends to see what's going up and down, or they're seeing their own data compared to other parts of the organization to build that accountability. So that's kind of one part on that end. And the other thing I've seen a lot is really making this part of your performance process. So not a checklist that sits on the side of, what we should do based on these results, but, what leaders, what are the one or top two things you're doing specifically, whether it's upskilling yourself or actual initiatives to be able to impact those, the voice you're getting or the results they're getting for their respective teams. So I find building that and making it important as part of a whole performance process is really important as well. And Kelly, I'm not sure if on anything on your side, have you done anything to make sure there's high adoption for managers to actually act on these results?
It is a big conversation for us. Most of us on my 100-person worldwide HR team are familiar with older annual traditional surveys where action planning was a huge push and frenzy and took up a lot of the organization's bandwidth. And so we've all got it in our heads that big action planning is really essential. And it might be, but we're sort of challenging ourselves to think a little bit differently about action and take it down to the manager level. If we're really bought into the idea that managers have the biggest power to influence people's engagement and retention, and they're a really key linchpin in this whole experience for employees, we're trying to empower managers to change the behavior at their level and also to have those meaningful conversations with employees. I think something about the old traditional model that was missed is a connection back to each individual. And so if I, as an employee, said, gave responses that weren't reflected in the larger aggregate of my business, then my individual responses were lost. And so the model where we have survey connected to performance and those meaningful conversations, then our theory is, and we've got to let it run out a little bit longer before we can prove how true it is that having those meaningful, connected individual conversations will make sure the employee knows that their individual voice was heard.
Great. And I know that we're about 5 or 6 minutes off. So maybe the last question that came in was just a quick one for you, Kelly, was just, does Trimble also conduct longer length annual surveys above and beyond the 4 quarterly ones you just mentioned?
In the past we did, but we've since abandoned that, and we will be sticking with the quarterly survey, but also growing into more pulsing over time. So the model will be pulsed throughout the year as needed in different businesses. Everyone wants to dive into some different things. So we'll continue to grow that, but we won't go back to any sort of once a year survey.
Okay, great. So I think we've taken a little more than people's time than we wanted to. There's a couple of last questions, which we're happy to respond outside of the webinar, but I can't say enough. Kelly, thanks for sharing your journey and your approach, and obviously really appreciate the kind words about the WorkTango group and team. And we kind of relish the experience to work with you and your team. But again, appreciate everyone taking the time today to join us. Thanks again, and hopefully see you at our next webinar.